The scent of rain-soaked asphalt and burnt rubber hung heavy in the air, a gritty perfume for the city's unforgiving streets. It was in this chaotic symphony of screeching tires and panicked shouts that a life was saved and another began to unravel. An old man, his face a roadmap of kind wrinkles and startled fear, stood frozen in the crosswalk, a dropped bag of groceries scattered around his feet like fallen soldiers. The delivery truck, its driver oblivious and likely texting, had run the red light, a multi-ton metal beast closing in with horrifying speed. But before the inevitable impact, a blur of motion, a ragged figure darting from the shadows of an alleyway, slammed into the old man. The force of the impact sent them both tumbling onto the safety of the sidewalk just as the truck roared past, its horn blaring a belated, useless warning. The old man, Samuel, gasped for air, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at his savior, a woman so thin her cheekbones were sharp angles under a layer of city grime. Her clothes were tattered, her hair a matted tangle, but her eyes, for a fleeting moment, held a fierce, protective light. Then that light flickered and died. Her body, having spent its last ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength, went limp. She collapsed onto the pavement, a fragile heap of discarded humanity, the soft thud of her head against the concrete lost in the receding traffic noise. Samuel, his own shock momentarily forgotten, knelt beside her, his hand trembling as he reached for her wrist, searching for a pulse. It was there, but faint, a delicate butterfly's wing against his calloused thumb. He didn't know who she was, this ghost from the alley, but she had just thrown herself in front of a truck for him. As the first sirens began to wail in the distance, a low, predatory rumble grew louder, eclipsing the emergency response. A procession of Harley-Davidsons, their chrome gleaming like polished skeletons under the gray sky, turned the corner. At their head was a man built like a mountain, his leather cut adorned with the menacing angel of a notorious motorcycle club. He swung his leg over his bike, his heavy boots hitting the pavement with a sound like judgment. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, scanned the scene. The scattered groceries, the retreating truck, his father on his knees next to a fallen woman. He was Jax Corbin, president of the Iron Disciples, a man known to most as Reaper, and the world had just made the grave mistake of touching his family. He strode forward, his face a mask of controlled fury, the single question burning in his mind, not just who this woman was, but what hell she had been running from that made saving a stranger the last, desperate act of a life already spent. Her sacrifice had just become his debt, and Reaper always paid his debts, often with an interest compounded in blood and bone. This woman's collapse was not an ending. It was a trigger, and the sound it made was the cocking of a hammer on a gun that had been silent for far too long. The truth she held, locked away behind a wall of trauma and fear, was about to be dragged into the light, and it would expose an evil so profound that even the devils on their iron horses would be forced to play the part of avenging angels. What she revealed would change everything. The antiseptic smell of the hospital was a stark, sterile contrast to the raw, visceral world Jax inhabited. It was a place of quiet beeps and hushed whispers, a world away from the roar of engines and the crack of knuckles. He stood outside the emergency room, his massive frame seeming to shrink the already narrow hallway. His leather cut, a symbol of power and rebellion on the street, felt alien and out of place here. His father, Samuel, sat on a hard plastic chair, his face pale, his hands still trembling slightly. He had recounted the story 3 times now, each telling filled with more awe and gratitude for the homeless woman who now lay in a bed just a few feet away. Her identity still a mystery, listed only as Jane Doe. Jax listened, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the frosted glass of the door. He wasn't a man given to overt displays of emotion, but the thought of his father, the one gentle soul in his chaotic life, almost being erased from existence, sent a cold dread coiling in his gut. Grizz, his sergeant-at-arms, stood beside him, a silent, bearded monolith whose presence was as comforting as it was intimidating. He had been the first one Jax had called, his voice a low growl over the phone. "My old man, there was an incident. Get to St. Mary's." No other words were needed. A doctor, a young woman with tired eyes and a weary set to her shoulders, finally emerged. "Are you the family of the man who was brought in?" "Mr. Corbin." Samuel stood up, his movement stiff. "I'm fine, doctor. I'm here for her. The woman who saved me. Will she be all right?" The doctor's expression was grim. "Physically, her head injury is a mild concussion. We're monitoring it. But that's the least of her problems." She lowered her voice, her gaze flicking to Jax's imposing figure. "Sir, the woman you brought in is suffering from severe malnutrition and dehydration. We found extensive bruising, old and new, across her torso and arms. Some are faded, yellow and green. Others are fresh, deep purple. We also found evidence of older, poorly healed fractures in her ribs and one in her left wrist. These are not injuries one sustains from living on the street. These are defensive wounds. These are injuries consistent with prolonged, brutal physical abuse." The air in the hallway turned to ice. Samuel staggered back, his hand flying to his mouth as he leaned against the wall for support. The image of the frail, dirty woman who had saved him was replaced by a far more horrific one. A victim, a prisoner. Grizz let out a low, guttural curse under his breath. But Jax remained perfectly still, his face unreadable. The doctor's words were like a key turning a lock in the darkest cellar of his memory. He was no longer in the sterile hospital corridor. He was 16 again, standing in a different hospital, the same antiseptic smell choking him. He remembered his younger sister, Sarah, her face swollen and bruised, her arm in a cast, her eyes, once so full of life, hollowed out by a fear he couldn't comprehend. He remembered the man she had been dating, a charismatic monster who had charmed his way into their lives before revealing the venom beneath his smile. Jack had been too young, too powerless then. The system had failed her. The police reports, the restraining orders, they were just pieces of paper. They hadn't stopped the final, brutal attack that had broken her spirit long before it broke her bones. The rage that had been born in him that day, a cold, hard diamond of fury, had never truly gone away. It had fueled him, shaped him, driven him to build a brotherhood of men who lived by a different code, a code where justice wasn't a suggestion, but a guarantee. He looked from the doctor's compassionate face to his father's horrified one. This Jane Doe, this nameless savior, was not just a stranger anymore. She was Sarah. She was every woman who had ever been made to feel small and afraid by a man who mistook cruelty for strength. His hand clenched into a fist so tight the leather of his glove creaked in protest. He turned to the doctor, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that held the weight of a promise and a threat. "Do whatever it takes to make her well. Send me the bill. All of it. My father owes her his life. That makes her family." He turned to Grizz, the storm clouds in his eyes now coalescing into a thunderhead. "Find out who she is. Find out who did this to her. Tear this city apart if you have to. We're not just finding him. We're going to erase him." Samuel looked at his son, seeing past the tattoos and the leather, past the fearsome reputation of Reaper, and saw the fiercely protective boy he had raised. He saw the pain of the past galvanizing the present. This wasn't just about a debt of gratitude anymore. For Jax, this had become a crusade. A ghost from his past had been given a new face, and this time, he had an army at his back to ensure the ending would be different. The quiet of the hospital was about to be shattered by the roar of righteous vengeance. The Iron Disciples Clubhouse was a fortress of brick and steel tucked away in the city's industrial gut, a place where the laws of the outside world were politely ignored. The main room smelled of stale beer, old leather, and engine oil, the holy trinity of the biker world. A massive oak table, its surface scarred with decades of knife marks and beer rings, dominated the center of the room. This was Jax's war room. A large whiteboard, usually reserved for planning runs and club business, had been wiped clean. In its center, Jax had written 2 words in bold, black marker, Jane Doe. Grizz stood beside him, a phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low growl as he called in favors from the club's extensive network of contacts. Bartenders, mechanics, tow truck drivers, even a few disillusioned beat cops who preferred the disciples' brand of justice to the system's bureaucratic crawl. Yeah, she's small, maybe 5'4", looks homeless, but the doc says she's clean, just starved, Grizz relayed. Hair's brown, tangled. Eyes? Jax, what color were her eyes? Jax paused, his mind replaying the fleeting moment of contact before she collapsed. They were green, he said, the words heavier than he expected. Like sea glass, Grizz repeated the description into the phone, then listened, his brow furrowed. Nah, nothing. All right, call me if you hear anything. He hung up, slamming the phone down on the table in frustration. Zilch. It's like she dropped out of the sky. No one in the shelters recognizes her. No one on the streets seen her before today. It's like she doesn't exist. The only clues they had were the contents of her pockets, laid out on the table like sacred relics. A single, tarnished brass key to a lock that could be anywhere, a book of matches from a high-end restaurant called the Sterling Perch, and a small, worn photograph, folded and refolded so many times the creases were almost white. Jax picked up the photo. It showed the woman, their Jane Doe, looking younger, healthier. Her smile was genuine, lighting up those sea glass eyes. Standing next to her, with his arm possessively around her shoulder, was a man. He was handsome in a sterile, corporate way, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, his smile a flash of brilliant white teeth. But there was something cold in his eyes, a predatory glint that the camera had captured, a look of ownership that made the hairs on Jax's arms stand up. Who the hell is this guy? Grizz muttered, leaning in for a closer look. Looks like one of the downtown suits. The kind who think they own the world. Jax flipped the photo over. Faintly, in faded blue ink, were two words, my Isla. Isla, Jax said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. He wrote it on the whiteboard next to Jane Doe. That's her name. He then turned his attention to the book of matches. The Sterling Perch. That's one of those rooftop places, right? The ones where a steak costs more than my bike's transmission. Yeah, Grizz confirmed. Owned by some tech mogul or something. Richard Sterling. Guy's a big shot. Supposedly untouchable. Charity balls, political donations, the whole 9 yards. A cold certainty began to settle in Jax's stomach. The suit in the photo. The name on the high-end restaurant. Sterling. He looked at the man's face in the photograph again, at the possessive grip on Isla's shoulder, and a piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't a random street tough who had hurt her. This was someone with money, with power. Someone who could make a person disappear, or make them so terrified they'd rather live as a ghost on the streets than return to a gilded cage. Give me everything you can on Richard Sterling, Jax commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. I don't care what it takes. Financials, business partners, ex-wives, who he pays to clean his damn shoes. I want to know where he breathes, where he sleeps. And I want to know if a woman named Isla has ever been seen with him. Grizz nodded, his expression grim. He knew that look in his president's eyes. It was the look he got right before the storm broke. And Reaper, Grizz added, his voice soft but firm. The doc called. She's awake. Jax's head snapped up. The investigation, the theories, the anger, it all receded for a moment, replaced by a single, urgent need. He had to see her. He had to look into those sea glass eyes and let her know, without a single word, that the hell she had been living was over. He grabbed his cut from the back of his chair and headed for the door, the weight of his sister's memory and Isla's future settling on his shoulders like a shroud. The hunt had a name, and soon it would have a face. Isla's first conscious thought was of a relentless, rhythmic beeping. It was steady, impartial, a sound so different from the chaos that had filled her head for months. The second was the smell, clean, sharp, and sterile. Not the cloying scent of Richard's expensive cologne or the metallic tang of her own blood. She cracked her eyes open, the fluorescent lights above her bed making her wince. A white ceiling, white walls, a thin, white blanket covering her. Her heart began to pound, a frantic drum against her ribs. Where's she? This wasn't the alley. This wasn't the street. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. He had found her. He had brought her to one of his private clinics, a place where no one would hear her scream. Her breath hitched, and she tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness and a dull ache in her head pushed her back down against the pillow. A soft, wrinkled hand gently touched her arm. "Easy now, child. You're safe." She turned her head, her vision slowly focusing on the kind face of an old man sitting in a chair beside her bed. It was the man from the crosswalk. The memory flooded back. The truck, the shove, the jarring impact with the pavement. "You're okay?" she whispered, her throat dry and raw. Samuel smiled, a warmth radiating from him that felt utterly foreign to her. "I am, thanks to you. You saved my life." "My name is Samuel Corbin." Isla stared at him, confusion warring with the ingrained terror that screamed at her to run, to hide. Safe? She hadn't been safe in 3 years. Safety was a myth, a fairy tale told to children. The real world was Richard Sterling. The real world was a penthouse apartment that was a prison, with windows that looked out over a city she couldn't touch. It was the sickening smile he gave her right before his hand lashed out. It was the way he would apologize afterward, his voice a smooth balm over the fresh wounds, promising it would never happen again, a lie she had stopped believing after the second time. Her escape had been an act of pure desperation. He had been out of the country for a week. She'd had 24 hours. She had gathered what little cash she could find, grabbed the photo, the one from before, when his eyes had only held a hint of the monster he would become, and ran. She didn't take her phone. He could track it. She didn't use her credit cards. She just ran, melting into the city's anonymous crowds, trading her designer clothes for rags in a shelter donation bin, trying to become invisible. But his influence was everywhere. She saw his face on billboards, his name on charity event banners. The city itself felt like it belonged to him. For 2 weeks, she had lived in the shadows, growing thinner, weaker, more hopeless. The alley had been her final refuge, the place she had huddled, shivering, before seeing Samuel in the path of that truck. Her body moved before her mind could process it. A single, selfless act in a life that had been defined by his selfishness. The door to her hospital room opened, and Isla flinched, her body coiling like a startled animal. A man filled the doorway, his sheer size blocking out the light from the hall. He was covered in leather and tattoos, his face carved from granite, his eyes holding an intensity that both terrified and captivated her. He was the antithesis of Richard's smooth, polished cruelty. This man was raw power, a force of nature. He looked from Samuel to her, and his hard expression softened by a fraction of a degree. "Isla," he said. Her name. He knew her name. The panic returned, a freezing wave. He worked for Richard. He was here to take her back. Her breathing quickened, the beeping of the heart monitor accelerating in response. "Please," she whimpered, her voice cracking. "Please don't. I won't go back. I can't." The big man, Jax, took a half step into the room, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace, a gesture that looked almost comical given his intimidating presence. "We're not here to take you anywhere you don't want to go," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My father told me what you did. You saved him." He gestured to Samuel. "That makes you important to us. And we protect what's important to us." He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she shrank away from him, and he understood. This wasn't a woman who would be comforted by words. Trust, for her, was a shattered thing. He knelt down, a mountain of man bringing himself to her level, trying to seem less threatening. "The doctor told us about your injuries," he said softly. "The old ones. We know you've been running from someone." He pulled the folded photograph from his pocket, holding it out for her. "Is this him?" Isla stared at the photo, at Richard's smiling face, and a sob escaped her lips, a raw, wounded sound. She nodded, unable to speak, the image confirming her worst fears. He was still out there. His shadow still loomed over her. Jax's jaw tightened. "Richard Sterling," he said, the name tasting like poison. "We know." Isla's head snapped up, her sea-glass eyes wide with a new kind of fear. Not for herself, but for them. "You can't," she whispered urgently. "You don't understand. He's not just some man. He's powerful. He has people everywhere. He'll destroy you. He'll hurt you for helping me." Samuel put his hand on her arm again. Child, you don't know my son. Jax looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time, Isla didn't see a threat. She saw a promise. It was a terrifying, dangerous promise, forged in some fire she couldn't comprehend, but it was a promise nonetheless. Let him try, Reaper said. In the chilling finality of those 3 words, Isla felt the first, fragile flicker of something she thought she had lost forever: hope. The Iron Disciples network moved with the ruthless efficiency of a predator closing in on its prey. While Jax and Samuel stayed at the hospital, providing a silent, watchful guard over Isla's room, Grizz and the rest of the club turned the city upside down. The name Richard Sterling was no longer just a name on a whiteboard. It was a target. Grizz sat in a dimly lit booth at the back of a smoky bar, a place that catered to the city's underbelly. Across from him sat a man named Silas, a disgraced former detective who now made a living selling information to those who operated outside the law. Silas was sweating, despite the cool air in the bar. Look, Grizz, you've got to understand, he stammered, wiping his brow with a napkin. This isn't some street-level punk. Sterling is connected. I'm talking political ties, judges in his pocket. He's got a private security team made up of ex-military mercs. The guy's a ghost. His public life is squeaky clean. Philanthropist of the Year, Grizz slid a thick envelope across the table. I'm not interested in his public life, he said, his voice flat. I'm interested in the dirt, the whispers, the things people are too afraid to say out loud. Silas eyed the envelope, his greed warring with his fear. He licked his lips and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. They say he has a temper. A nasty one. There have been incidents. A business partner who suddenly retired after a disagreement. A journalist who was digging into his finances and got into a car accident. Nothing ever sticks. He's too insulated. Silas paused, then added the crucial piece. And there have been women. A string of them. They show up on his arm at galas, beautiful, perfect. Then, after a few months, they just vanish. New city, new life, always with a generous settlement and a non-disclosure agreement thicker than a phone book. But one of them tried to talk. A model named Sophia. She ended up in a psychiatric facility. A complete breakdown, they called it. Her family said she was terrified of him. Grizz's knuckles were white where he gripped his beer mug. This was the pattern. The isolation, the control, the disposal. Isla wasn't the first. She was just the first to escape his grasp and fall into theirs. Where does he live? Grizz asked. The Apex Tower. Penthouse. The whole top floor. It's a fortress. Biometric locks, 24/7 surveillance, armed guards in the lobby. You can't get within 100 feet of the elevator without a key card back at the clubhouse. The information was added to the board. A map of the Apex Tower's location. A list of Sterling's known associates. A photo of the model, Sophia, her haunted eyes a chilling echo of the fear they'd seen in Isla's. Jax, having returned from the hospital, stared at the board, processing the information. His rage was a cold, simmering thing now, honed to a razor's edge. Brute force wouldn't work here. This wasn't a bar fight. This was a siege. He's insulated, Jax stated, his gaze sweeping over his men who had gathered in the room. He thinks his money and his high-rise castle make him untouchable. He's used to dealing with cops he can buy and rivals he can crush with lawyers. He's not used to dealing with us. He tapped the photo of Richard Sterling on the board. Men like him have a weakness. Pride. He believes he is in complete control. Isla's escape is an insult to that pride. He won't let it go. He'll be hunting for her. A younger member, a prospect named Rook, spoke up. So what's the plan, Prez? We can't just storm the tower, no. Jax agreed. We don't go to him. We let him come to us. He turned to Grizz. He doesn't know she's with us. He just knows she's gone. He'll be using his resources to find her. Hospitals, shelters, morgues. He'll be discreet at first, but he'll get desperate. I want eyes on every hospital in this city. I want our people talking to every nurse, every orderly. The second a man fitting Sterling's description or anyone asking about a Jane Doe fitting Isla's description shows up, I want to know Jax's plan began to form, a multi-layered strategy born of cold fury and tactical precision. He thinks he's the hunter. We're going to make him the prey. We're going to let him find her right where she is. And when he walks into that hospital, thinking he's about to drag her back to his cage, he's going to walk into a trap. A grim silence fell over the room as the weight of the plan settled in. They were using Isla as bait. It was a dangerous, risky move. Grizz voiced the concern. Reaper, is she strong enough for that? To see him again? Jax's mind went back to the hospital room, to the terror in Isla's eyes, but also to the flicker of defiance he'd seen when she warned them about Sterling. She has to be, he said, his voice laced with a conviction he wasn't sure he felt. This can't end with her hiding for the rest of her life. It ends when he's broken. It ends when she sees him fall. He looked around at the faces of his brothers, men who had pledged their lives to the club and its code. He built his empire on fear. It's time we showed him what real fear looks like. The disciples dispersed, their movements purposeful and silent. The trap was being set. The bait was in place. All they had to do now was wait for the monster to emerge from his castle and step into the light. The hospital became a strange sort of sanctuary, a sterile bubble where the outside world, for a time, couldn't touch Isla. The physical nourishment from the 4 drips and bland hospital food began to mend her body, but the nourishment for her soul came from an unlikely source, Samuel Corbin. He was a constant, gentle presence at her bedside. He didn't push her talk about what happened. Instead, he talked about his late wife, about the garden he kept, about the stray dog he'd once taken in that became his most loyal companion. He told her stories of Jax as a boy, a stubborn, fiercely loyal kid who once got into a fight with 3 older boys for stealing his sister's lunch money. Through his stories, Isla began to see the man behind the intimidating Reaper persona. She saw the source of his protective fire. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the window, Samuel brought a small, potted orchid and placed it on her bedside table. "My wife, Eleanor, loved these," he said softly. "She said they were like the strongest people. They look delicate, but they can bloom in the harshest conditions. They just need a little bit of light and a reason to grow." Isla reached out and gently touched one of the petals, the first voluntary, curious gesture she had made since waking up. A fragile trust was beginning to form, a tiny green shoot pushing its way through the barren soil of her trauma. But the peace was a fragile illusion. At the clubhouse, the wait was a study in coiled tension. The disciples maintained their vigil, a citywide net of eyes and ears. They took shifts watching the hospital from parked vans and nearby rooftops, their communication disciplined and terse over encrypted channels. Grizz was coordinating the effort, his usual gruff humor replaced by a grim focus. He sat at the head of the great oak table, a map of the city spread before him, marked with the locations of their lookouts. The call came on the 3rd day. It was from Spike, a lanky biker with a knack for blending in, who was posted in the hospital coffee shop. "Got him," Spike's voice crackled over the radio. Black sedan, tinted windows. 2 suits got out first, scoped the entrance. Then he stepped out. "It's Sterling. He's walking in now, heading for the front desk." Grizz was on his feet instantly. "What's his play?" "He's smooth," Spike reported. "Told the receptionist his niece was in a car accident, and he just heard she was here. He's laying on the charm," showing him a picture on his phone. "It's her. They're looking her up now. Jane Doe, room 307". Grizz relayed the information to Jax, who was in a maintenance van parked across the street, watching the hospital's main entrance through a pair of binoculars. "He's on his way up, Reaper. Just him. The 2 goons are staying by the car. Let him." Jax's voice was calm, a chilling counterpoint to the impending storm. "Everyone hold position. He walks in. He sees her. I want him to think he's won. I want him to feel that control he loves so much. Right before I take it from him." Inside room 307, Isla was sitting up in bed, talking quietly with Samuel when she heard the footsteps in the hall. They were crisp, expensive shoes on polished linoleum, a sound she knew as well as her own heartbeat. Her blood ran cold. The door swung open. Richard Sterling stood there, his face a perfect mask of concerned relief. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than the hospital bed she was sitting in. He ignored Samuel completely, his eyes locking on Isla. "Isla, My love, he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. My God, I've been worried sick. I've been searching everywhere for you. Isla felt the air leave her lungs. The fragile sanctuary of the room shattered. All the progress, all the flickers of hope, were extinguished by his presence. He was the monster from her nightmares, standing in the light, and he was smiling. What happened to you? Why did you run away? He asked, taking a step into the room. It was the same tone he always used, the one that implied everything was her fault. Samuel stood up slowly, placing himself between Richard and the bed. I think you should leave, the old man said, his voice quiet but firm. Richard's eyes flickered to Samuel for the first time, a flash of annoyance crossing his features. And you are? It doesn't matter who I am, Samuel replied. The lady doesn't want you here. Richard let out a soft, condescending chuckle. I think you misunderstand. Isla is with me. She's just a little confused right now. We're going home. He took another step, intending to brush past Samuel, but the old man held his ground. She's not going anywhere with you, Samuel said. The mask of charm finally slipped from Richard's face. His eyes turned cold, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. Old man, you have about 3 seconds to get out of my way before I have you removed. You have no idea who I am. Oh, I think we do. A new voice rumbled from the doorway. Richard spun around. Jack's Reaper, Corbin, filled the entrance, his arms crossed over his chest. Behind him in the hallway, the hulking figures of Grizz and 2 other disciples blocked the path, their leather cuts a stark declaration of allegiance. The atmosphere in the room crackled with sudden, violent tension. Richard Sterling's eyes widened slightly, his gaze flicking from Jax's face to the patch on his vest. This wasn't a security guard he could intimidate or a cop he could buy. This was something else entirely. This was a complication he hadn't anticipated. His carefully controlled world had just been invaded by barbarians. This is a private family matter, Richard said, regaining his composure, his voice tight with restrained fury. Jax took a slow, deliberate step into the room. The floor seemed to vibrate with his presence. She's not your family, he said, his voice a low growl. He looked over at Isla, who was watching, pale and trembling, from the bed. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw the spark he was hoping for. The spark of defiance. She told you to leave. She is coming with me. Richard hissed, his arrogance overriding his caution. You have no right? Jax cut him off with a harsh laugh. Let me tell you about rights. He took another step, closing the distance between them until he was towering over the impeccably dressed man. The smell of leather and road grime overwhelmed Richard's expensive cologne. You have the right to turn around and walk out that door. You have the right to never come near her again. If you choose to ignore those rights, Jax leaned in, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, then we're going to have a very different conversation. One that doesn't involve words. Richard Sterling, a man who moved in circles of power and influence, who could ruin lives with a single phone call, found himself for the first time in a long time, completely and utterly powerless. He was trapped between a stubborn old man and a biker who looked like he had been carved from vengeance itself. The hunter had walked into the trap. Richard Sterling's mind raced. His usual arsenal of tools, money, influence, intimidation, rendered useless against the raw, unyielding force standing before him. He was a man accustomed to controlling every variable, yet here he was, cornered in a hospital room by a pack of leather-clad thugs. His gaze darted to Isla, a flicker of pure venom in his eyes. This was her fault, this defiance. He would deal with her later, and he would make her regret it. I don't know who you think you are, Richard began, trying to project an authority he no longer felt, but I am warning you. Jax didn't even let him finish. He simply raised a hand, a silent, absolute command that shut Richard's mouth. You're not in a position to warn anyone, Jax said, his voice dangerously calm. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn around. You're going to walk out of this hospital. You're going to get in your shiny car, and you're going to drive back to your glass tower. And you're going to forget the name Isla. You're going to forget this room, this hospital, and this conversation. Because if I ever see your face again, if I even hear a whisper that you've tried to contact her, I will personally dismantle your entire world. brick by brick. Is that clear? The threat was not loud or boisterous. It was delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon, and it was all the more terrifying for it. Richard, for all his power, understood the language of violence. He saw in Jax's eyes a promise that went far beyond a simple beating. It was a promise of utter annihilation. He swallowed, the sound loud in the tense silence. He gave one last, hateful look at Isla, a look that promised retribution, then turned on his heel. He brushed past Jax without a word, his shoulders stiff with humiliation. Grizz and the other disciples parted like the Red Sea to let him pass, their eyes following him with cold contempt. They watched from the end of the hall as he stabbed the button for the elevator, his composure crumbling with every second he was forced to wait. When the doors finally opened, he disappeared inside without a backward glance. The moment he was gone, the tension in the room deflated, leaving a vacuum of shock and adrenaline. Isla let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body slumping in relief. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time, they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of release. Samuel rushed to her side, patting her hand gently. "It's over, child. He's gone." Jax remained by the door, watching her. He had seen her face when Richard had been there. The terror was undeniable. But he'd also seen her straighten her shoulders, lift her chin. He'd seen her silent refusal to be cowed. That small act of courage in the face of her tormentor was more powerful than any punch he could have thrown. "He won't give up that easily," Jax said, his voice pulling Isla's attention. "Men like him don't. Their pride won't let them. He'll be back." The flicker of hope in Isla's eyes dimmed. "Then what do we do?" she whispered. "We get you out of here," Jax stated simply. "Now, Grizz," he barked into his shoulder radio. Phase 2. Now, down in the parking lot, Richard Sterling slid into the back of his sedan, his face a thunderous mask of fury. "Drive," he snarled at his driver. To the two bodyguards in the front seat, he spat, "Find out who those bikers are. I want names, I want addresses. I want to know everything about them. And I want this hospital security footage. I want to know how she got here. I'm going to bury them," but as their car pulled out of the parking lot, a beat-up tow truck suddenly swerved in front of them, blocking the exit. The driver, a burly biker, hopped out and started fiddling with something under his hood, feigning a breakdown. At the same moment, a large panel van screeched to a halt behind Sterling's sedan, boxing it in. The side door of the van slid open, and two more disciples stepped out, their expressions grim. Sterling's bodyguards reached for the weapons holstered under their jackets, but it was too late. From the hospital service exit, a side door rarely used, Jax emerged, helping Isla into the back of a waiting, nondescript SUV driven by Samuel. Isla was still in hospital-issue sweatpants and a t-shirt, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, but she was moving with a purpose. Grizz jumped into the passenger seat, and the SUV peeled out of the service alley, turning in the opposite direction of the blocked main exit. "What's happening?" Isla asked, looking back toward the commotion. "A diversion," Jax explained, his eyes scanning the mirrors. "They think they're trapping us, but they're the ones in the box. They'll be stuck there for at least 10 minutes before they realize you are never going to leave through the front door." The SUV sped through the city's back streets, Samuel driving with a calm competence that belied his age. They were a strange sight. The grizzled old man at the wheel, the mountain of a biker in the passenger seat, and the fragile, recovering woman in the back, wrapped in a hospital blanket like a refugee. They were leaving the sterile safety of the hospital behind, heading into an uncertain future. But as Isla watched the city lights blur past, she realized she wasn't a prisoner anymore. She was a passenger in an escape. Sterling's men would eventually get free. They would realize the deception. The hunt would begin again, but this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't running alone. She was running with monsters of her own. The roar of a nearby Harley echoed through the streets as another disciple joined them. Falling into formation behind the SUV, a leather-clad guardian angel on an iron horse. The chase was on. The safe house was a place that didn't officially exist. It was a small, unassuming bungalow on the city's forgotten fringe, owned by the club under a shell corporation. It had a chain-link fence, a patchy lawn, and peeling paint, the perfect picture of suburban anonymity. Inside, however, it was clean, secure, and stocked with everything they might need. The windows were fitted with reinforced glass, and the doors had deadbolts that looked strong enough to stop a battering ram. For Isla, it felt like the first real breath she had taken in years. The air didn't smell of Richard's oppressive cologne or the hospital's sterile dread. It smelled of pine cleaner and dust, a normal smell, a safe smell. Samuel immediately set about making the place feel like a home, putting on a kettle for tea and finding a thicker blanket for Isla. Grizz did a perimeter check, his massive form moving with a surprising stealth, ensuring every entry point was secure. Two other disciples, their bikes hidden in the garage, took up silent watch posts at the front and back of the house. Jax led Isla to a small, simply furnished bedroom. "You'll be safe here," he said. "No one knows about this place. Sterling can search all he wants. He won't find it." Isla stood in the middle of the room, clutching the blanket around her. She looked at the plain bed with its clean sheets, the small wooden dresser, the window that looked out onto a quiet, unremarkable street. It was a cage in a way, but it was a cage meant to protect her, not imprison her. The difference was everything. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. "All of you. You're risking so much for me." Jax just shook his head. "Sterling crossed a line when he hurt you. You saved my father. That makes this our fight. It's the code." He hesitated, a rare moment of uncertainty for him. "Try and get some rest. We'll be here." He turned to leave, but Isla's voice stopped him. "The code?" she asked, her curiosity momentarily overriding her fear. Jax turned back, leaning against the doorframe. He looked at the patch on his vest, the avenging angel with its sword and scales. "We're outlaws," he said, his voice low. "The world looks at us and sees criminals, thugs. And sometimes we are. But we have a code. We protect our own. We don't tolerate predators. And we have a special kind of hatred for men who hurt women and children." His eyes grew distant, and Isla knew he was seeing his sister again. "The world is full of monsters like Richard Sterling who hide behind money and power," he continued. "The system can't always touch them. So, sometimes, we have to." He didn't say any more. He didn't need to. In that moment, Isla understood the Iron Disciples. They weren't just a gang. They were a balancing force, a dark justice for a world that was often blind. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended reality. Isla began to heal. The color returned to her cheeks. She ate the simple meals Samuel cooked, her appetite slowly returning. She spoke more, her voice growing stronger. She told them about Richard, not just the abuse, but his methods, his paranoia, his business dealings. She mentioned a ledger, a small, black book he kept in a hidden safe in his office. He called it his insurance policy, she explained, her voice trembling at the memory. It had everything in it: bribes, illegal transactions, names of politicians, and police officials he owned. He said if anything ever happened to him, the contents of that book would burn half the city down. Jax and Grizz exchanged a look. This was it. This was the weapon they needed. It wasn't enough to just scare Sterling away. To truly free Isla, they had to destroy him, and that ledger was the key. "Where is the safe?" Jax asked. "In his penthouse office, behind a painting," Isla said. "A seascape. But you can't get to it. The security is impossible. Nothing is impossible." Grizz grunted. "Just difficult." While Isla recovered, the war outside was escalating. Sterling, enraged and humiliated, had unleashed his own army. His private security team, led by a ruthless ex-Special Forces soldier named Cade, was tearing through the city's underworld, shaking down informants, paying exorbitant sums for any scrap of information about the Iron Disciples. The Disciples felt the pressure. Their friendly contacts grew nervous. The police, likely prodded by Sterling's political allies, started harassing club members, pulling them over for minor infractions, trying to squeeze them. The city was becoming a chessboard, and Sterling was making his move. One evening, Rook, the young prospect, was cornered by 3 of Cade's men while leaving a bar. They didn't ask questions, they just attacked, trying to beat information out of him. But Rook, though young, was a disciple. He fought back with a feral intensity, holding his own until the roar of approaching Harleys sent his attackers scattering into the night. Grizz and Jax found him leaning against a wall, bleeding from a split lip but grinning with defiant pride. They wanted to know where the girl was. Rook spat, wiping blood from his chin. I told him to go to hell. Jax helped him up, his hand on the prospect's shoulder. The attack was a clear escalation. Sterling was no longer just searching. He was actively hunting them. They're getting desperate, Grizz observed, his eyes dark. That makes them sloppy. But it also makes them more dangerous. Jax's jaw was set like concrete. He wanted a war, he's got one. But we're not going to fight it on his terms. We're not going to brawl in the streets. We're going to cut the head off the snake. He looked from Grizz to Rook. It's time. We're going for the ledger. The plan they formulated was audacious, bordering on suicidal. A direct assault on the Apex Tower. It would require precision, timing, and a level of coordination that would test the disciples to their absolute limit. It was a multi-phase operation that left no room for error. Phase 1 involved Spike, the master of disguise, getting a job with the tower's janitorial service. Phase 2 was a technological assault, with a gifted hacker the club kept on retainer for special projects. Phase 3 was the infiltration itself. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But as Jax looked at the quiet house where Isla was finally learning to sleep without nightmares, he knew it was a gamble they had to take. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about liberation. They were going into the heart of the beast's lair, not just to steal his treasure, but to steal back Isla's future. The night of the operation descended on the city with a blanket of cold, drizzling rain. The streets glistened like black oil under the streetlights, the perfect cover for the shadows they were about to move through. At the safe house, the air was thick with a tense, focused energy. Isla, Samuel, and a few heavily armed disciples would remain behind, turning the bungalow into a final bastion. If the primary team failed, this would be their last stand. Isla stood by the door as Jax, Grizz, and a hand-picked team of 4 other disciples prepared to leave. They were dressed not in their usual leather cuts, but in dark, functional gear, black cargo pants, dark hoodies, and tactical vests. They looked less like bikers and more like a commando unit. Isla walked up to Jax, her fear for them a palpable thing. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "You don't have to do this." Jax looked down at her, his storm gray eyes softening for a moment. He had seen her transformation over the past week. The haunted, terrified woman from the hospital was being replaced by someone stronger, someone with a fire in her eyes that matched his own. "Yes, we do," he said simply. "This ends tonight. One way or another." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Stay with my father. No matter what you hear, you stay here. You're safe." Then, he and his team were gone, melting into the rainy night, leaving only the low rumble of their van's engine fading into the distance. Their target, the Apex Tower, was a spear of glass and steel piercing the low-hanging clouds, a monument to Richard Sterling's ego. Inside the van, parked a block away, the team did their final checks. "Spike is in position on the 45th floor," Grizz reported, monitoring a communications link. "Our hacker, Glitch, is ready." Jax looked at the schematics of the tower on a tablet. "Glitch, you're on, miles away." In a darkened room filled with glowing monitors, a young man with a shock of purple hair cracked his knuckles. "Showtime," Glitch muttered. His fingers flew across the keyboard, lines of code scrolling down the screen. He was a digital ghost, slipping past the tower's multi-million-dollar firewall, a shark in a sea of data. "I'm in," he announced over the comms. "Looping security feeds in the lobby and service corridors now. You'll have a 10-minute blind spot." Go Jax's team moved. They slipped out of the van and entered the tower through a service entrance, the lock already disabled by Spike from the inside. They moved silently up a series of stairwells, their progress tracked by Grizz on the tablet. Everything was going according to plan until they reached the 40th floor. "We've got a problem." One of the bikers, a quiet man named Shadow, whispered, pointing down the corridor. Two of Cade's private security guards were making an unscheduled patrol, a deviation from the patterns they had observed. They were trapped. "Glitch, what's going on?" Jax hissed into his radio. "New patrol, Rhoda." Glitch's panicked voice came back. "Sterling must have changed it an hour ago. They're not on my schematic. There was no time to retreat." The guards were getting closer. Jax made a split-second decision. He held up two fingers, pointing at himself and Grizz. Then he pointed down the hall. They would take them, fast and quiet. As the guards rounded the corner, Jax and Grizz moved from the shadows. It was brutally efficient. Before the guards could even register the threat, Grizz had one in a chokehold, lifting him off his feet, while Jax disarmed the other, a sharp blow to the man's wrist sending his firearm clattering to the floor. In seconds, both guards were unconscious, zip-tied, and dragged into a janitor's closet. But the fight, though brief, had not been silent. A dropped radio had crackled to life. "Patrol 2, what's your status?" a voice demanded. "They have been made." "Abort," Glitch yelled over the comms. "They're locking down the elevators. Kate is on his way up from the lobby." "No," Jax said, his voice hard as steel. "We're too close." He looked at the stairwell door. They would have to go the rest of the way on foot, a 20-floor climb, racing against Cade and his team coming up from below. It had gone from a stealth mission to a desperate, vertical race. "Go, go, go," Jax ordered. The team surged into the stairwell, taking the steps 2 and 3 at a time, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming. Below them, they could hear the heavy thud of combat boots on the concrete steps. Cade's team was closing in. They burst onto the 60th floor, the penthouse level, just as the elevator doors down the hall dinged, announcing Cade's arrival. "Grizz, you and the team, hold them off," Jax commanded. "Buy me time." Grizz and the other 3 disciples didn't hesitate. They took up defensive positions, using the corridor's marble planters for cover, as Cade and his 4 men, all armed with automatic weapons, fanned out from the elevator. The hallway erupted in a cacophony of shouts, and the terrifying, contained blasts of gunfire. While his brothers engaged in a desperate firefight, Jax sprinted towards Sterling's office. He kicked the door open and scanned the room. Just as Isla had described, a large seascape painting hung on the far wall. He tore it from its mount, revealing a high-tech biometric safe. "Glitch, I need you," Jax yelled. "On it," came the reply. "But the system is fighting back. Sterling's got a failsafe. If I trip it, it'll wipe the drive. I need more time." Outside, the firefight intensified. One of the disciples went down, clutching a wound in his leg. Grizz roared in fury, laying down a hail of covering fire. "Reaper, we can't hold them forever." Back in the office, the safe scanner glowed red. Almost there," Glitch muttered through the comms. Suddenly, the scanner flashed green. The safe clicked open. Jax reached inside and pulled out the small, black leather-bound ledger. He had it. Just as he turned to leave, the office door was kicked in again. It wasn't one of Cade's men. It was Richard Sterling himself, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage, a pistol gripped in his hand. "That," Sterling snarled, his eyes fixed on the ledger, "does not belong to you." The sound of the firefight in the hall faded away as the 2 alpha predators faced each other, the prize between them. The mission had reached its bloody, violent apex. The world narrowed to the confines of the opulent office, the scent of Richard Sterling's rage and Jax Corbin's cold determination filling the air. Outside, the sounds of the desperate firefight were a chaotic drumbeat counting down the final seconds of their lives. Sterling's hand, holding the pistol, was surprisingly steady. His eyes, burning with a proprietary fury, were locked on the black ledger in Jax's hand. "You have made a grave mistake, you filthy animal," Sterling hissed, his voice a low, venomous tremor. "You should have stayed in the gutter where you belong." Jax didn't flinch. He held the ledger up slightly, a taunting gesture. "This little book says you're the one who belongs in the gutter, Richie. Along with all your well-dressed friends." Sterling's face tightened, the insult hitting its mark. "That book is my property. Give it to me, and I might let your men walk out of here alive." "You're not in a position to make deals," Jax growled, taking a slow, deliberate step to the side, placing a large mahogany desk between them. He needed to create an opening, a moment's hesitation. It's over. Isla is gone. This book is ours. You have nothing left. I have her fear. Sterling screamed, his composure finally shattering completely. She will never be free of me. I will hunt her to the ends of the earth. And as for you, he raised the pistol, aiming it squarely at Jax's chest. In that split second, two things happened at once. Grizz, seeing Jax cornered, let out a primal roar and charged Cade, tackling the mercenary leader with the force of a runaway truck. The unexpected, suicidal maneuver threw the firefight into chaos, drawing the attention of Cade's men for a precious second. It was the opening Jax needed. He hurled the heavy ledger with all his might directly at Sterling's head. Sterling, startled, instinctively flinched, firing his weapon. The shot went wide, shattering a ridiculously expensive vase on a pedestal behind Jax. The heavy book struck Sterling on the side of his head, staggering him. Jax vaulted over the desk, a blur of motion, closing the distance before Sterling could recover. He slammed into the smaller man, driving him backward. The pistol flew from Sterling's grasp, skittering across the polished marble floor. Jax didn't stop. He grabbed Sterling by the lapels of his $1,000 suit and slammed him against the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the glittering, rain-swept city. The reinforced glass spiderwebbed with cracks, the terrifying sound echoing through the office. Below them, 60 stories down, the city lights swam like distant, indifferent stars. Sterling stared through the fractured glass at the dizzying drop, raw, primal terror finally eclipsing his rage. For the first time, he was facing not a business problem, but an abyss. "Please," he gasped, his voice a pathetic whimper. "Don't. You can have anything. Money, whatever you want." Jax leaned in, his face inches from Sterling's, his voice a deathly whisper. "I want you to feel it," he said. "Just for a second. The fear. The powerlessness. The feeling that your life is in someone else's hands. This is what you made Isla feel every single day." He pushed Sterling harder against the groaning window, the cracks spreading. Sterling screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound that was music to Jax's ears. Then, just as suddenly, Jax yanked him back, throwing him to the floor like a sack of garbage. The fight was gone from Sterling's eyes, replaced by the broken, pleading look of a defeated animal. At that moment, the office doors burst open. But it wasn't more of Cade's men. It was a full squad of heavily armed city police, tactical unit, their weapons raised. "Freeze! Drop your weapons!" The firefight in the hall had died down. Grizz and the other disciples, battered and bleeding but alive, were already being zip-tied. Cade and his surviving men, recognizing the cops, had surrendered. A well-dressed man in a suit, a detective, walked in, his eyes surveying the scene. Jax standing over the cowering Sterling, the cracked window, the ledger on the floor. "Jax Corbin," the detective said, his voice weary. "You've caused a lot of trouble tonight." Jax slowly raised his hands. He had known this was a possible outcome. Glitches hacked, the gunfire. It would have triggered every alarm in a 5-mile radius. It was part of the gamble. "He has a book," Jax said, nodding toward the ledger. "It'll put away half the powerful men in this city, including him. For crimes that make breaking and entering look like a parking ticket." The detective looked at Sterling, then at the ledger, then back at Jax. He let out a long sigh. "Get him out of here," he said to one of his officers, gesturing at Jax. As they led him away in handcuffs, Jax locked eyes with Sterling. The fear was gone from the mogul's face, replaced by a smug, triumphant sneer. He thought he had won. He thought his lawyers would have him out in an hour, and Jax and his men would rot. But as Jax was led past the detective, he whispered, "Check the inside cover of the book. There's a flash drive, a gift from our hacker friend. It's got everything. Already uploaded to a dozen journalistic servers, set to go public in 1 hour unless they get a deactivation code. From me." The detective's eyes widened slightly. He looked at Jax, then at the smirking Sterling, and a slow, grim smile touched his own lips. Jax had not just brought a knife to a gunfight. He had brought a nuclear bomb. The game wasn't over. It had just entered its final, explosive stage. As they put him in the back of the squad car, Jax Corbin, the Reaper, allowed himself a small, grim smile of his own. His freedom was forfeit for now, but he had won Islas, and he had just lit the match that would burn Richard Sterling's empire to the ground.